Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are exploring one of the absolute most significant paradigm shifts in the history of contemporary psychology. We're talking about the critical transition from monocultural to multicultural counseling. For decades, the field relied heavily on a one-size-fits-all approach to mental health. But, as we all know, human minds just don't come in one size. Understanding how to navigate this shift is absolutely crucial, whether you're working directly in the field of psychology or you're just looking to better understand human connection in our incredibly diverse world.
To help you deeply remember these concepts, we've got a clear roadmap for today. We'll be covering the paradigm shift, Sue's three-dimensional model, translating theory into practice, barriers to effective counseling, and finally, we'll look at why this whole thing is a lifelong developmental process.
Okay, let's dive right into Section 1, the paradigm shift, moving beyond Western assumptions.
So we really have to start by understanding the core problem that triggered this entire movement. Historically, psychological theories were developed almost exclusively within a Western, white, middle-class context, and then they were just universally applied to everyone else. Well, this massive blind spot led to the desperate need for multicultural counseling competence. This is defined as the ability of counselors to understand, appreciate, and effectively work with clients whose cultural backgrounds differ from their own. And listen, this isn't just some optional bonus skill to pad out a resume. Without this competence, counselors literally cannot provide ethical or effective services. You simply cannot adequately assess, intervene, or even build a solid relationship with a client if you don't understand the cultural lens through which they view the world.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why this shift is mandatory. Let's just consider the definition of psychological maturity. In a lot of Western, highly individualistic societies, independence and autonomy are held up as the ultimate gold standards for healthy development. But conversely, in many collectivist societies, family interdependence and communal decision-making are actually the true signs of healthy psychological adjustment. If a counselor isn't culturally competent, they might misdiagnose a collectivistic client who simply wants to consult their family before making a choice as being inappropriately dependent or immature, when in reality, that client is demonstrating profound cultural maturity.
That brings us to Section 2, Sue's three-dimensional model, the core framework.
To solve this widespread problem of misdiagnosis and cultural misunderstanding, Wing Sue and his colleagues developed a framework that is essentially built on three equal interconnected pillars: awareness, knowledge, and skills. Now, it is incredibly important to remember that these are not just isolated compartments. Think of them like a giant puzzle. These three dimensions are highly interdependent, and they interact continuously throughout the entire counseling process. You really can't just have one without the others and expect to be effective.
You can logically think of these as sequential steps, forming the acronym AKS. Step 1, cultural awareness. Step 2, cultural knowledge. And Step 3, cultural skills. Let's systematically dissect each one of these right now to permanently anchor them in your memory.
So Step 1 is cultural awareness. This means continuously examining your own cultural assumptions, your biases, your values, and your limitations. Self-awareness is the absolute foundation of everything else we're going to talk about. Why? Well, because therapists are not blank slates. They are cultural beings themselves, and their perceptions are completely shaped by their own lifelong socialization. Before you can even attempt to understand a client's culture, you have to realize that your own worldview does not equal universal reality.
If a counselor fails to develop this deep self-awareness, it inevitably leads to ethnocentrism. Basically, this means interpreting other cultures according to your own cultural standards. For instance, you might unconsciously assume a lack of eye contact means a client is being dishonest or insecure, when in another culture, that exact same behavior is actually a sign of profound respect. A therapist might genuinely believe they're helping a client, all the while imposing their own cultural values onto them and silently judging any behaviors that deviate from their own normal.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is Step 2, cultural knowledge. It isn't just about reading a textbook and memorizing trivial facts about different demographic groups. True cultural knowledge requires a deep understanding of complex, lived realities. We're talking about a group's historical experiences, their migration patterns, the societal barriers they face, like systemic discrimination, and the unique family or religious systems. True knowledge is what actively reduces misunderstanding and vastly improves diagnostic accuracy.
Let's look at a concrete example of why this knowledge is so vital. Understanding refugee mental health requires deep knowledge of war trauma, forced displacement, cultural loss, and the incredible compounding stress of resettlement. Without this highly specific cultural knowledge, a counselor might observe a refugee's reaction to trauma and completely misinterpret it as evidence of severe psychopathology. They might hand down a heavy, lifelong psychiatric diagnosis when, in context, the client's reaction is actually a fully understandable, normal response to extreme, prolonged displacement.
Let's move to Section 3 and see how this builds. Translating theory into practice. Actionable interventions.
Having all that awareness and knowledge in your head is a great start for sure, but it is totally useless unless it translates into Step 3, cultural skills. This is where the rubber meets the road. It means actively modifying therapeutic techniques, using culturally appropriate communication styles, utilizing interpreters effectively, adapting clinical assessments so they aren't biased, collaborating with community resources, and even actively advocating for marginalized populations. A culturally skilled counselor never rigidly applies one single therapeutic model to every single client. Instead, they dynamically adapt their interventions to fit the client's lived cultural reality.
This brings us to Section 4, barriers to effective counseling, systemic and individual obstacles. Because even with the absolute best intentions, things can go wrong. A massive barrier comes in the form of stereotyping. When counselors hold on to rigid beliefs, say, assuming all women are emotionally dependent, all refugees are severely traumatized, all older adults are cognitively impaired, or all people with disabilities are just helpless, they dangerously reduce the rich complexity of the human experience. Relying on stereotypes completely ruins treatment planning. Why? Because the counselor ends up treating a caricature of a group, rather than the living, breathing, unique individual sitting right in front of them. Another profound barrier is language. Sue's research actually highlights case studies where clients drop out of therapy entirely simply because language barriers completely undermine the process. You see, language doesn't just transfer raw data. It expresses deep emotion, identity, symbolism, and nuanced cultural meaning. Even highly skilled interpreters can struggle to accurately translate culturally specific concepts, and that can easily lead to weakened rapport, major clinical miscommunication, and ultimately the premature end of therapy altogether. Then there's an incredibly sophisticated barrier, the culture-bound nature of counseling itself. Think about it. Traditional Western counseling inherently assumes that a healthy person should express their feelings openly, they should comfortably discuss personal problems with a total stranger, and they should always prioritize their individual goals. However, many cultures emphasize emotional restraint, deep family obligation, and social harmony over individual venting. If a counselor rigidly pushes those traditional techniques, their therapy will inadvertently conflict with the client's deeply held values. In that case, the therapy itself literally becomes the barrier.
And hey, we must remember that not all barriers are just inside the mind. Many are massive, structural, institutional barriers. We're talking about the absence of available interpreters, physically inaccessible facilities, culturally biased assessment tools that skew clinical data, the urban concentration of services that leaves rural clients completely stranded, profound economic obstacles, and a sheer lack of trained professionals. These structural barriers disproportionately restrict service for the very marginalized groups who often need it the absolute most.
All right, let's wrap this up with Section 5, a lifelong developmental process beyond final achievement.
As we critically evaluate multicultural theory, we ultimately face a humbling but very necessary truth. Complete multicultural competence may actually be impossible. And that's simply because no counselor can ever fully master all cultural experiences. Therefore, this isn't a final destination. It isn't some badge you earn and then you're just done. It is a professional necessity that requires continuous, lifelong humility, ongoing learning, and active social justice advocacy to challenge those exact structural barriers we just talked about.
So, I want to leave you with this question to ponder. Based on the framework you've just learned in this explainer today, in your own profession, whether you are a counselor, a manager, a teacher, or just a colleague, are you genuinely aware of your own unconscious ethnocentrism? Are you actively looking for the invisible institutional barriers that might be holding others back? Thank you so much for exploring this vital paradigm shift with me. Keep examining those assumptions and keep learning.